The end of a great empire often conceals a strange and powerful beginning. The collapse of forgotten civilizations did not just create empty ruins, it secretly built the foundations of our modern world. This video will reveal how ancient collapses directly spark the ideas of democracy, global trade, and the scientific mind. We will uncover how the mysterious fall of the Minoan Sea Kings and the silent abandonment of Indus Valley cities set forces in motion that would one day shape our lives. You will see history's grand cycle, where chaos inevitably gives way to creation. What forgotten story from the past do you believe still whispers to us today? The fall of an empire is a whisper, not a scream. It rarely happens in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow and quiet unraveling. Think of the great Roman Empire. Its true end was not marked by one final battle, but by the gradual silence on its vast network of roads, the slow drying up of its magnificent aqueducts, and the fading memory of a shared law that once bound millions together. This is the nature of historical collapse. It is the failure of complex systems under their own weight. Environmental strain weakens the foundation. Economic instability fractures the structure. Social fragmentation pulls the people apart. Historian Joseph Tainter presents a compelling idea that societies can become too complex to sustain themselves. The very systems designed for stability, the bureaucracy, the specialized labor, the massive infrastructure, eventually demand more energy and resources than they can produce. The center cannot hold, but within that failure lies a profound secret. The resulting vacuum is not merely empty space, it is a fertile ground. When the old, rigid structures shatter, they release their grip on new ways of thinking. The collapse of a complex society, while devastating for those who live through it, clears the stage for the next act of human innovation. It is this dynamic that transforms an ending into a catalyst, a necessary clearing away of the old to make room for the new and unexpected. Long before Rome's roads were even a dream, a different kind of empire thrived in silence. The Indus Valley Civilization was a Bronze Age marvel of order and peace, its cities laid out with a geometric precision that would not be seen again for thousands of years. In metropolises like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, every home was connected to a sophisticated, city-wide drainage system. They used standardized bricks and uniform weights for trade across a vast region, evidence of a powerful, centralized authority. Yet this was an empire without obvious palaces, grand temples, or monumental statues of kings. Its power was not etched in stone, but woven into the fabric of daily life, a quiet testament to social cohesion. So what could possibly cause such a stable and advanced society to simply vanish? The answer lies not in a single invasion or catastrophe, but in a slow, environmental unraveling. Around 4,000 years ago, the climate began to shift. The mighty rivers that were the lifeblood of this civilization, the Indus and the Ganga-Hakra, started to change their courses. Monsoon patterns grew unreliable, leading to extended periods of drought. The land that once yielded abundant harvests began to fail. This was not a sudden collapse, but a grinding, generations-long struggle against a changing world. The social contract that held these cities together, their complex system of resource distribution and trade, began to fray under the strain. There is no evidence of a great war or violent overthrow. Instead, the archaeological record shows a gradual thinning out. People simply began to leave. They packed their belongings, their knowledge, and their skills, and they walked away from their magnificent cities, leaving them to the dust. This great dispersal, however, was not an end. It was a necessary scattering. the farmers, artisans, and traders of the Indus Valley did not disappear. They migrated eastward and southward, carrying with them the seeds of their advanced knowledge. They brought their agricultural techniques into the fertile Ganges plain. They spread their understanding of trade, metallurgy, and urban planning across the Indian subcontinent. The rigid, centralized structure of their old civilization was gone, but its components were now set free to mix and merge with other cultures. The void left by their departure created a vacuum, a blank slate. Into this space slowly moved the pastoral, horse-borne Vedic peoples from the northwest. The interaction between the dispersed Indus populations and the incoming Vedic cultures created a powerful new synthesis. The old, indigenous traditions of the land blended with new languages and social structures. From this centuries-long fusion emerged the foundational elements of classical Indian civilization, including the earliest strands of what would become Hinduism. The collapse of one forgotten empire did not bring darkness. It fertilized the soil for a new world to grow. Far out in the Mediterranean Sea, on the sun-drenched island of Crete, another forgotten empire flourished in brilliant color. The Minoans were not like the orderly, land-based rulers of the Indus Valley. Their power was built on the sea. They were master shipbuilders and traders, their vessels crisscrossing the waves to connect the ancient world from Egypt to Anatolia. Their grand, multi-story palaces, like the labyrinthine complex at Knossos, were not fortified castles but vibrant economic and religious centers, adorned with breathtaking frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful bull leapers. This was a society that seemed to pulse with life, confidence, and a deep connection to the natural world. Then, around the year 1450 before the Common Era, their world shattered. A cataclysm of almost unimaginable scale occurred on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, a mere 100 kilometers north of Crete. The volcanic eruption there was one of the most violent in human history, spewing ash and rock into the atmosphere and generating colossal tsunamis that would have smashed into the northern coast of Crete with devastating force. The Minoan fleet, the very source of their wealth and power, was likely obliterated in its harbors. The ashfall would have crippled agriculture for years. In the wake of this natural disaster, their sophisticated society, built on delicate trade networks and maritime dominance, was left critically vulnerable. It was then that a new power, the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland, saw their opportunity. These were a more warlike people, organized around fortified citadels. They moved in not to destroy everything but to take control. They occupied the grand Minoan palaces and began to administer what was left of the trade routes. But a fascinating transformation occurred. The conquerors were captivated by the culture of the conquered. The Mycenaeans eagerly absorbed Minoan influences, adopting their advanced architectural techniques, their vibrant artistic styles, and even their system of writing, which they adapted to record their own early form of Greek. Symbols from Minoan religion, like the double-headed axe and the sacred bull, were woven into Mycenaean myths. The collapse of Minoan sea power did not erase their legacy. Instead, it acted as a cultural transfusion. The refined knowledge and artistry of the Minoans were filtered through the more militaristic, practical Mycenaeans, who then carried this blended heritage forward. When the Mycenaean civilization itself eventually fell centuries later, its stories, its art, and its gods did not vanish. They entered the realm of oral tradition and legend, becoming the raw material from which classical Greece would later draw its own identity. The philosophical and artistic brilliance of Athens, the epic poems of Homer, all owe a hidden debt to that cataclysmic eruption and the fall of a sea-based empire on Crete. One civilization's tragic end became the essential fertilizer for the roots of our own Western world. Deep in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, a third forgotten empire forged its legacy not in stone but in fire and metal. The Hittites were the masters of iron, while their contemporaries relied on bronze, a softer alloy of copper and tin. The Hittites perfected the art of smelting iron ore in high-temperature furnaces. This gave them a terrifying military advantage. Their weapons were stronger, their chariots more durable, and their armor offered better protection. From their fortified capital of Hattusa, they commanded an empire that rivaled Egypt and Babylon, a dominant force in the ancient world. Yet, around the year 1200 before the Common Era, their centralized power imploded. They were caught in the same storm of chaos that swept across the Mediterranean, a period we now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. A combination of factors, from mysterious invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples to internal rebellions and severe, prolonged droughts, shattered their political structure. The Hittite state did not just weaken, it completely dissolved, its great cities abandoned and its royal line extinguished. But the empire's most vital secret did not die with its last king. The Hittites had closely guarded their ironworking techniques, treating the knowledge as a state secret to maintain their monopoly on power. With the collapse of their centralized authority, that monopoly was broken. The skilled metalworkers, the smiths who once served the Hittite elite, were suddenly free agents. They dispersed in every direction, taking their invaluable knowledge with them. They migrated to new lands, from the Levant to Cyprus and across the Aegean, setting up their forges and teaching their craft to local populations. This technological diffusion was nothing short of a revolution. Iron ore was far more common and accessible than the tin and copper needed for bronze. Suddenly, ordinary farmers could afford an iron plowshare that was vastly more effective at turning tough soil than a wooden or bronze one. This led to an agricultural boom, feeding larger populations. Warriors who were not part of a royal elite could now own a strong, reliable iron sword. The widespread availability of iron tools and weapons fundamentally leveled the playing field. It broke the power of the old Bronze Age aristocracies, whose status was built on controlling the rare materials for bronze. The collapse of the Hittite Empire, therefore, did not send the world into a dark age. It forced a technological dawn. By shattering a centralized power and scattering its most valuable knowledge, it directly accelerated humanity's transition from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, empowering a new, more diverse set of societies with the tools to build a different future. Across the Atlantic, in the steamy lowlands of what is now Mexico, a different kind of foundation was being laid. The Olmec civilization rose from the jungle, creating the first great cultural blueprint for all of Mesoamerica. We know them today for their astonishing colossal heads, 17 giant stone portraits of rulers with stoic, powerful features, each one carved from a single basalt boulder and weighing many tons. But these heads are just the most visible legacy of a profoundly influential society. The Olmecs were pioneers. They developed a complex calendar system, a form of hieroglyphic writing, and a distinct artistic style centered on a powerful, half-human, half-jaguar deity. They built the first major ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, with their distinctive earthen pyramids and grand plazas designed for ritual and community. Then, around 400 years before the Common Era, their heartland was largely abandoned. The great centers fell silent, and the jungle began to reclaim the plazas and monuments. The reasons remain one of history's quiet mysteries. Was it a shift in the course of vital rivers disrupting their agriculture? Was it volcanic activity, or perhaps internal social unrest that fractured their political unity? The evidence is unclear, pointing not to a single cataclysm but to a slow fading. Yet this fading was not a death, it was a dispersal. With the decline of the central Olmec power, their cultural sphere fragmented. But the ideas, the symbols, and the knowledge they had perfected did not vanish. Instead, they radiated outward, carried by trade, migration, or perhaps by Olmec priests and artisans seeking new patrons. These seeds found fertile ground in the emerging societies on the rise in the region. The Maya, who would later build vast city-states with towering temples and make breathtaking advances in mathematics and astronomy, drew deeply from the Olmec well. They adopted and refined the Olmec calendar and writing systems. The Zapotecs, building their magnificent hilltop city of Monte Alban, incorporated Olmec artistic motifs and religious concepts into their own culture. The Olmec vision of the world, their understanding of the cosmos and the relationship between rulers and the divine, became the fundamental grammar for the civilizations that followed. The collapse of this mother culture did not leave a void. It created a diaspora of genius, scattering its cultural DNA across Mesoamerica. This allowed for a remarkable experiment to unfold, where different peoples, from the Maya to the Zapotecs to the people of Teotihuacan, could take these shared foundational ideas and develop them in their own unique, spectacular directions. The end of the Olmecs was not an ending at all, but the essential precondition for the brilliant, diverse tapestry of cultures that would define the region for more than 1,000 years. South of the glittering pyramids of Egypt, a different kind of power rose from the desert sands. The Kingdom of Kush in Nubia was not merely a neighbor to the pharaohs, it was a rival, a peer, and for a time, a conqueror. For nearly a century, the Black Pharaohs of Kush's 25th dynasty ruled a unified Egypt and Nubia, building their own monuments and leaving an indelible mark on the Nile Valley. But empires shift like desert dunes. Around the year 350 of the Common Era, a new force emerged from the Ethiopian highlands. The Aksumite Empire, with its powerful navy and control over Red Sea trade, launched a devastating invasion. The capital of Kush, the city of Marave, was sacked and its power broken. The centralized state that had managed the flow of wealth across the Sahara for centuries was suddenly gone. The great trade routes, once buzzing with caravans carrying gold, ivory, and exotic goods, fell into a deep silence. This collapse could have been a final, dark ending. Yet, as with the Hittites and their iron, the most valuable resource of Kush was not its gold, but its people and their knowledge. The dispersal that followed the Aksumite conquest was not a retreat into oblivion. It was a great migration of intellect and skill. Nubian administrators, metalworkers, and artisans, carrying the sophisticated traditions of their kingdom, moved southward and eastward, away from the crumbling center. They carried with them the advanced ironworking techniques that had fueled Kushite industry. They brought a deep understanding of statecraft, of how to manage resources and govern a kingdom. This knowledge did not vanish. It flowed like a river into new lands, seeding the development of emerging societies in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa. Here, in kingdoms that would later rise to prominence, we find echoes of Kushite influence in their political structures and their mastery of iron technology. The fall of Kush did not extinguish a light. It scattered its embers, and those glowing fragments found fresh tinder in new lands, helping to ignite the flames of future African kingdoms. The collapse of one center of power simply redirected the flow of culture and innovation, proving that the end of an empire can be a redirection, not a dead end. History often presents the fall of empires as isolated tragedies, but sometimes they fall together like a line of dominoes. The collapse that swept across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 before the Common Era was not a series of separate events. It was a single, catastrophic systems failure. The mighty Hittite Empire in Anatolia vanished. the palatial fortresses of the Mycenaeans in Greece were burned and abandoned. Even the powerful Egyptian New Kingdom, though it survived, was left battered and shrunken, its wealth and influence drained away. This was the late Bronze Age collapse, a near-total unraveling of the interconnected world. What could cause such a widespread disaster? It was a perfect storm of crises, a prolonged period of drought and climate change, confirmed by ancient tree rings and sediment cores, led to crop failures, famine, and mass migrations. Desperate groups, whom the Egyptians mysteriously called the Sea Peoples, began raiding coastlines and attacking empires, their origins still debated by historians. At the same time, internal rebellions and the sheer complexity of managing these vast, interlinked states made them brittle. The entire region was like a tightly woven net. When a few critical strands snapped, the whole thing gave way. The result was a dark age. Literacy disappeared in Greece for centuries. Long-distance trade routes, the lifeblood of these bronze-based economies, collapsed. Grand palaces and central authorities were gone. Yet, this apparent catastrophe was also a great reset. The fragmentation of massive, top-down empires into smaller, independent city-states and regional powers created a laboratory for human innovation. Without a pharaoh or a great king dictating terms, communities had to govern themselves. They experimented with new forms of leadership, new laws, and new social contracts. They had to become more self-reliant, more resilient. The old, rigid international system was shattered, and in its place arose a world of fierce competition and local ingenuity. This painful but necessary period of fragmentation and adaptation cleared the very ground upon which the classical civilizations of Greece, Phoenicia, and Israel would later be built. It is a powerful reminder that our world is deeply interconnected, and that the fall of a single pillar can bring down the entire roof, but the rebuilding that follows often creates a stronger, more adaptable structure. The true test of an empire's strength is not its wealth or its armies, but its relationship with the sky and the soil. We see this pattern etched into the ruins of Mesopotamia, where the mighty Akkadian Empire, one of the world's first great multinational states, simply ceased to function. For centuries, it had thrived on the bounty of the Fertile Crescent, its power flowing through intricate canals and a sophisticated agricultural system. Then, around 2200 years before the Common Era, the rains failed. A mega-drought lasting for more than a century gripped the region. Ancient dust records from the Gulf of Oman tell a story of catastrophic windstorms carrying topsoil from the parched plains of Akkad and depositing it far out to sea. The empire's grain stores emptied. The social contract, which promised security in exchange for obedience, shattered. People abandoned the great cities, scattering in search of water and food. This was not a military defeat, but a slow, suffocating collapse brought on by a changing climate. A similar drama unfolded centuries later and an ocean away in the lush heartland of the Maya. Their civilization was a tapestry of brilliant city-states, connected by trade, rivalry, and a shared belief system. They mastered their environment with complex water management systems, capturing rainwater in vast reservoirs to survive the dry seasons. But when a series of intense, multi-decade droughts struck between the 8th and 10th centuries, even their ingenuity reached its limit. The reservoirs dried up. Crop yields plummeted. The kings, who were believed to be divine intermediaries responsible for bringing the rains, lost their authority. The population faced a stark choice: starve in the magnificent stone cities or disperse into the jungle. In both cases, the environmental crisis acted like a stress test, revealing a fatal flaw in these complex societies. Their very success had made them brittle. They were optimized for a specific set of stable conditions. When those conditions vanished, the entire structure, from its religious justification to its economic distribution, fractured under the strain. Yet the story does not end with empty cities. The survivors of the Akkadian collapse did not simply vanish. They migrated, carrying with them the knowledge of Akkadian administration, law, and advanced farming techniques. They brought this expertise to new lands and emerging powers like the later Babylonian and Assyrian empires who would learn from Akkad's fate. The Maya, too, did not disappear. They moved away from the great political centers, establishing smaller, more adaptable communities in the highlands or along the coasts. This great scattering was a painful but necessary adaptation. It forced a diversification of survival strategies, where once a single, monolithic agricultural system supported a vast population, now many smaller, localized methods were experimented with and refined. This dispersal of people and knowledge led to the development of more resilient farming practices, crop varieties suited to different soils, and a deeper, more distributed understanding of how to live with a changing environment. The surplus food and stability that would later fuel the growth of medieval and modern societies were built, in part, upon the hard-won lessons of these ancient climate refugees. The collapse of their empires was a brutal teacher, but its curriculum in resilience would one day feed the world. A monopoly on knowledge is the ultimate source of an empire's power, but its collapse is the ultimate act of liberation. The fall of the Roman Empire did not mean that Roman engineering was forgotten. Instead, the central authority that once directed the construction of aqueducts and legionary roads was gone. The specialized engineers, the stonemasons, and the surveyors who once served the empire now had to find new work. They dispersed across Europe, taking their skills with them into local villages and emerging kingdoms. The grand continent-spanning aqueducts fell into disrepair, but the core principles of the arch and hydraulic engineering did not vanish. They were adapted on a smaller, more human scale. Local lords used these techniques to build fortified bridges and simple water mills. The knowledge became democratized, no longer reserved for imperial glory but applied to local needs. This pattern repeated itself on the other side of the world. When the mighty Han dynasty in China fragmented, its brilliant imperial workshops lost their exclusive funding. Closely guarded secrets of silk production and papermaking were no longer confined to the court. Skilled artisans, seeking new patrons or simply survival, traveled along the very trade routes the Han had once protected. They carried their expertise to Korea, to Japan, and eventually along the Silk Road to the west. What was once an imperial luxury, a symbol of the emperor's divine mandate, slowly transformed into a more widely available commodity. This is the hidden engine of progress that collapse ignites. When a central power shatters, it breaks its monopoly on innovation. The specialized knowledge that was hoarded at the top for prestige and control is suddenly set free. It flows outward, down to the grassroots level, where it is picked up, experimented with, and improved upon by a much wider range of people. The fall of an empire, therefore, does not halt technological advancement. It accelerates it by forcing a great dispersal of ideas, creating 1,000 new points of light where before there was only one brilliant, centralized sun. When the political and social pillars of an empire crumble, the spiritual foundations of a society are often exposed to the open air. The slow decline of the Roman Empire created a profound vacuum of meaning. The old state gods, so closely tied to the idea of Roman power and victory, seemed to have failed. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, new beliefs began to flow into the cracks. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, offered a compelling alternative. It presented a universal message of hope, personal salvation, and a community that transcended the fading borders of the empire. It was a moral framework built for a world in transition, providing stability and purpose when earthly institutions were failing. This was not a simple erasure of the old ways, but a complex transformation. Ancient Roman festivals were rebranded with Christian meanings. Pagan temples were often dismantled, and their stones were used to build churches, a physical metaphor for a new spiritual order rising from the old. A similar cultural rearrangement occurred half a world away in the wake of Teotihuacan's fall. That magnificent city of pyramids, once the undisputed center of Mesoamerican culture, saw its influence wane around the 6th century. Its grand plazas emptied, and its power to enforce a single cultural vision faded. This collapse did not create a cultural desert. Instead, it allowed for a flowering of distinct new city-states, each with its own interpretation of the shared Mesoamerican heritage. The Maya city of Tikal, for instance, absorbed Teotihuacano influences into its own unique artistic and political identity. Elsewhere, new powers like the Toltecs rose, blending the old gods of Teotihuacan with their own warrior ethos to create a fresh religious synthesis. The feathered serpent god, known in Teotihuacan, would be reimagined and worshipped for centuries as Kukulkan by the Maya and Quetzalcoatl by the Aztecs. This is the hidden pattern within the chaos of collapse. It forces a great cultural conversation. Old deities are not simply destroyed, they are reinterpreted. Established philosophies are challenged, creating space for new questions and new answers. This intellectual friction, born from the breakdown of a single, dominant worldview, is the very engine that drives cultural evolution. The rigid orthodoxy of an empire gives way to a vibrant pluralism where multiple beliefs can coexist, compete, and cross-pollinate. This messy, creative diversity is not a step backward. It is the fertile ground from which the complex, multifaceted societies of the modern world would eventually grow. A monopoly on power is a fragile thing. When the Western Roman Empire disintegrated, its vast, centrally managed trade routes did not simply vanish into thin air. Instead, they shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. The great grain shipments from Egypt and the state-controlled flow of Spanish olive oil ceased, but the human need for connection and commerce did not. From the ruins, a new, more dynamic system began to pulse with life. It was not run by a single emperor or a centralized bureaucracy. It was a world of decentralized networks, a tapestry woven by Vikings carrying furs and amber down Russian rivers, Arab merchants navigating the Indian Ocean with exotic spices, and Italian sailors from city-states like Venice and Genoa reconnecting the Mediterranean. These were smaller, more agile operators, and their networks possessed a remarkable strength that the old Roman system had lost: resilience. If one route was blocked by war or a local dynasty fell, these merchants could simply shift to another path. They were not bound to a single, vulnerable center. This constant, fluid competition became a furnace for innovation. New financial instruments like letters of credit were invented to facilitate trade over long distances between strangers. Maritime insurance emerged to manage the risks of these daring voyages. This was not commerce by imperial decree. It was commerce born of sheer necessity and opportunism. Centuries later, a similar phenomenon blossomed in the cold waters of the North and Baltic Seas. The Hanseatic League was not an empire, but a loose confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities from Lubeck to Novgorod. It arose precisely because there was no dominant central power in the region after the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. These cities cooperated to protect their mutual interests, establishing trading posts and agreeing on common standards, yet they remained fiercely independent. This decentralized model allowed for a spectacular diversity of economic and political experiments to flourish simultaneously. In one Hanseatic city, you might find a merchant-led republic, while another was ruled by a local bishop or duke. This was a grand, real-world laboratory for governance. The competitive pressures of this networked world forced cities to become more efficient, to offer better terms to artisans and traders, and to develop more sophisticated legal systems to resolve disputes. The very ideas that would later underpin modern capitalism and republican government, from double-entry bookkeeping to civic citizenship, were not born in the heart of a mighty empire, but in the bustling, independent ports that grew in the fertile soil of imperial collapse. The end of monolithic control did not bring chaos. It unleashed a wave of adaptive and creative economic structures that ultimately proved far more durable and transformative than the empires they replaced. An empire's end is written not only in its abandoned cities but in the very bloodlines of its descendants. When the Western Roman Empire fragmented, its borders ceased to be walls and became instead a series of open doors. Germanic tribes like the Visigoths and Franks moved into former Roman provinces, not merely as conquering armies, but as entire peoples seeking new homes. They were pushed and pulled by forces like the movement of the Huns from the east, creating a chain reaction of human resettlement. For centuries, historians viewed this as a simple story of replacement, one people displacing another. But modern genetic science reveals a far more intricate tapestry. Ancient DNA evidence now shows that these migrations resulted in profound and lasting mixing. The populations of modern Spain, France, and Italy carry distinct genetic signatures from these ancient movements, a living record of Goths intermarrying with Roman Celts, of Lombards settling alongside local Italians. This was not an erasure of the past, but a biological and cultural fusion that created the diverse genetic landscape of modern Europe. A similar, even more vast transformation was unfolding simultaneously in Africa. Driven by the development of new ironworking skills and likely by population pressures, Bantu-speaking peoples began a long, gradual expansion from their homeland in West-Central Africa. This was one of the most significant migrations in human history, a slow wave of movement that washed over the continent for thousands of years. These were not just warriors, but farmers and herders carrying a powerful cultural package. They brought with them advanced metallurgy, sophisticated agricultural techniques for growing yams and oil palms, and new traditions. As they moved east and south, they did not simply conquer and leave. They interacted with the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations they encountered, from the San peoples of the Kalahari to the East African foragers. Genetic studies confirm extensive intermingling with modern populations across sub-Saharan Africa, showing how these ancestral lines intertwined. The Bantu expansion spread a family of languages that are spoken by hundreds of millions today, but it also wove together a richer, more complex human fabric. These great migrations, so often triggered by the collapse of an old order, demonstrate a fundamental truth about humanity. Our instinct is not to vanish, but to move and to merge. The end of a political structure unleashes a powerful current of human movement, and in that movement, genes and cultures blend in unpredictable and resilient new combinations. This constant genetic reshuffling is the unseen bedrock of our modern diversity, a biological renewal that ensures no collapse is ever truly an end. A language is the ultimate archive of a people's soul, and when an empire fractures, its official tongue shatters into 1,000 beautiful fragments. The slow political disintegration of the Western Roman Empire did not mean that Latin simply died. Instead, it went underground, flowing out of the formal Senate and into the vibrant streets, markets, and farms of the provinces. Cut off from the centralized authority of Rome and its scholars, the common, spoken form of Latin, known as Vulgar Latin, began to drift. Isolated from one another by the collapse of long-distance travel and trade, regional dialects evolved in their own unique directions. The Latin spoken in Gaul absorbed words and sounds from the local Celtic languages and the Germanic speech of the Frankish rulers. In Iberia, it mingled with the tongues of the Visigoths. In each place, over centuries, the grammar simplified, pronunciations shifted dramatically, and new words were born from local necessity. From this glorious, organic chaos, entirely new languages emerged. What was once a single, imperial language gave birth to the poetic cadence of Italian, the passionate rhythm of Spanish, and the elegant flow of French. This was not a decay of communication, but a creative explosion. The rigid structure of classical Latin, perfect for law and administration, was broken open, releasing a torrent of new expressive potential. This linguistic liberation directly fueled an artistic renaissance. For the first time, poets and storytellers began composing great works not in the formal Latin of a dead empire, but in the living, breathing languages of the people. In France, the epic Song of Roland celebrated Frankish heroism in Old French, its verses sung in courts and villages, forging a new cultural identity. In Italy, Dante Alighieri did the unthinkable. He chose to write his monumental Divine Comedy not in Latin, but in the Florentine vernacular. In doing so, he did not just tell a story, he proved that a modern, local tongue could carry the full weight of philosophy, theology, and human emotion, effectively establishing the foundation of the Italian language itself. A parallel story unfolded on the other side of the world. The decline of the Gupta Empire in India, a golden age of Sanskrit literature, saw the fragmentation of its cultural sphere. The classical Sanskrit of the courts and priests gradually gave way to the rise of Prakrits, the everyday spoken languages of the people. These Prakrits, evolving in regional isolation, slowly transformed into the earliest forms of the modern Indo-Aryan languages we know today, including Hindi, Bengali, and Marathi. This linguistic diversification was not a sign of cultural poverty. It was a necessary scattering, a democratization of expression that allowed for a richer, more regionally nuanced tapestry of literature and thought to develop. The collapse of a central linguistic authority, whether in Rome or Pataliputra, did not silence human creativity. It forced it to find new, more diverse voices, proving that the end of a single, official story is often the beginning of 1,000 new ones. The silence left by a fallen emperor is filled with the sounds of local hammers forging new bonds of loyalty. As Rome's centralized authority dissolved, the vast, impersonal machinery of the empire was replaced by something far more intimate and far more fragile, the personal oath. This was the birth of feudalism, a system not of grand laws but of local promises. A knight would pledge his military service to a lord in exchange for a parcel of land and protection. That lord, in turn, might swear fealty to a more powerful duke or king. It was a pyramid of personal obligations, a decentralized web of power that provided a crucial, localized stability in a world without police or a standing army. While it seems a world away from modern democracy, this network of sworn contracts planted a revolutionary seed. The relationship between a lord and his vassal was not one of absolute domination. It was a mutual agreement with responsibilities on both sides. If a lord failed to provide protection or justice, the vassal's oath could be considered void. This concept of reciprocal obligation, of rights and duties embedded in a social contract, would echo for centuries, eventually influencing the development of parliamentary systems and the very idea that governance is a two-way street. A similar political transformation unfolded on the other side of the world, in the refined courts of Japan. The elegant Heian court, with its emperors and aristocratic families, gradually saw its real power wane, becoming consumed with poetry and aesthetics while the countryside grew restless. Into this power vacuum stepped a new class, the samurai. These provincial warriors, originally hired to protect aristocratic estates, soon became the true power brokers. The result was the shogunate, a unique system where the emperor remained a divine figurehead in Kyoto, but true military and political authority rested with the shogun, a supreme general. This was not a rejection of order, but a reorganization of it. The shogunate created a stable, hierarchical state run by a military class whose code of conduct, Bushido, emphasized duty, honor, and loyalty to one's immediate lord. It was a pragmatic solution to the chaos of a fading central government, proving that political legitimacy could be built on martial prowess and feudal loyalty as effectively as on imperial bloodlines. From the castles of Europe to the dojos of Japan, these new political structures were vast, unplanned experiments in human organization. They were messy, often violent, and far from perfect, but they were necessary laboratories. They tested different models of how to distribute authority, how to maintain order without a central tyrant, and how to balance the rights of the ruler with the responsibilities owed to the ruled. The feudal councils where vassals advised their lords evolved into early forms of representative bodies. The legal codes of the shogunate demonstrated how a society could function under a rule of law distinct from a single monarch's whim. These were the gritty, practical foundations upon which the modern concepts of the nation-state, constitutional monarchy, and even representative democracy would eventually be built. The collapse of a single, overwhelming power did not lead to perpetual darkness. It forced humanity to innovate, to build new forms of community from the ground up, one local oath at a time. An empire's economy is a cage of control designed to funnel wealth toward a single center. The Byzantine Empire maintained a vice-like grip on the lucrative trade routes for spices and silks coming from the east, their capital of Constantinople acting as a golden choke point. For any European merchant, dealing with the Byzantines was a costly necessity. But when that empire finally crumbled, the cage door swung open. The old routes were blocked or became prohibitively expensive under new Ottoman rulers, creating a powerful and desperate incentive. European kingdoms, now cut off from the riches they craved, were forced to bet on a radical idea. What if they could bypass the land entirely and reach the source of this wealth by sea? This was not a planned initiative, but a frantic scramble born from economic collapse. It led directly to the daring voyages of explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, whose journeys were funded by monarchs gambling on new paths to the Indies. The age of exploration, with all its world-altering consequences, was fundamentally sparked by the collapse of a single, rigid economic system. A parallel story unfolded across Asia. The vast Mongol Empire had once unified the Silk Road under a single, terrifying authority, creating an unprecedented flow of goods and ideas from Europe to China. But when that empire fragmented, the overland routes became unstable, plagued by warring successor states and bandits. The cost and risk of sending caravans across continents skyrocketed. Yet human ingenuity abhors a vacuum. As the land routes faltered, merchants turned their gaze to the sea. This push led to a spectacular flourishing of maritime trade in the Indian Ocean. Arab, Indian, Chinese, and later Portuguese sailors mastered the monsoon winds, creating a vibrant, decentralized network of ports from Kilwa to Malacca. This was not a single, controlled highway, but a sprawling, competitive marketplace on the water. The need to finance these long, risky voyages and manage wealth across vast distances spurred incredible innovations. Double-entry bookkeeping was perfected in Italian city-states to track complex partnerships. Early forms of joint stock companies emerged, allowing investors to pool their capital and share the risks of a voyage, a concept that would become the cornerstone of modern capitalism. Letters of credit and maritime insurance became standard practice, creating the financial infrastructure for a global economy. The collapse of these old, extractive empires did not end trade. It forced it to evolve, to become more agile, more inventive, and far more resilient. The end of top-down control unleashed a wave of entrepreneurial energy that connected the world in new ways, proving that the death of one economic order is often the painful, necessary birth of another. A crisis does not merely destroy buildings, it shatters certainties. When the world you know falls apart, the old explanations no longer seem to hold, and a desperate, powerful curiosity is born. This is the hidden role of collapse in the history of science. The rigid frameworks of thought that dominate stable empires begin to crack under the pressure of catastrophe, forcing humanity to look at the world with fresh eyes. Consider the sheer devastation of the Black Death in the 14th century. While not the collapse of a single empire, it was a collapse of the medieval world order. The disease wiped out as much as half of Europe's population, and the most trusted authorities of the age, the church and the nobility, were utterly powerless to stop it. Prayers and processions failed. This massive failure of the established world created a deep and profound disillusionment. People began to question everything. If the old authorities had no answers for this horror, then perhaps truth lay elsewhere, in direct observation of the world, in practical humanist inquiry, and in the rediscovery of ancient knowledge that offered different perspectives. This collective trauma did not create the Renaissance directly, but it fertilized the intellectual soil, making Europe receptive to the revolutionary ideas that would soon follow. A similar, more deliberate preservation of knowledge occurred as the Abbasid Caliphate, once a beacon of learning, began its long decline. As political unity fragmented, the great house of wisdom in Baghdad faced danger, but the vast body of classical knowledge it had gathered, from Greek philosophy to Persian astronomy, did not simply vanish. It was carried by scholars to the new centers of power, most brilliantly to Moorish Spain. In cities like Cordoba and Toledo, this knowledge was not just stored away, it was actively challenged, expanded upon, and refined. Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked side by side, translating ancient texts, improving mathematical concepts, and conducting new experiments in medicine and optics. They were not merely passive librarians, they were active innovators. This flourishing of science on the periphery of a dying empire created a reservoir of advanced learning. When this knowledge eventually filtered back into a Europe recovering from its own crises, it provided the very tools, the mathematical language, and the philosophical frameworks that thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo would use to challenge the geocentric universe. The European scientific revolution was, in many ways, sparked by ideas that had been kept alive and advanced during the political collapse of their original patrons. When the old answers fail, new questions become a matter of survival. Societal breakdowns, for all their terror, force a paradigm shift. They clear away the intellectual orthodoxy that can stifle curiosity, creating a vacuum where observation and reason can finally take root. The most profound scientific leaps often occur not in times of perfect stability, but in the unsettling, fertile silence that follows a great fall. The great city of Rome, once home to over 1 million people, saw its population dwindle to a mere 30,000 souls. This was not an isolated tragedy, but a recurring pattern in the wake of imperial collapse. When the central authority that pumps life into a metropolis vanishes, the mega-city cannot sustain itself. The aqueducts fall silent, the grain shipments cease, and the immense population that was drawn to the center of power must scatter to survive. Yet this scattering is not a retreat into chaos. It is a reorganization of human life on a more manageable, more resilient scale. Across Europe, as Rome faded, new towns began to sprout like seedlings after a forest fire. They did not grow in the shadow of imperial palaces, but around the protective walls of a local lord's castle or the spiritual sanctuary of a monastery. These were not planned cities but organic communities. A castle offered safety, attracting farmers, bakers, and blacksmiths to settle nearby. A monastery, with its scribes, gardens, and need for supplies, became a different kind of nucleus for trade and learning. These smaller urban centers fostered a powerful new sense of local identity. People were no longer anonymous subjects of a distant emperor. They were citizens of their town with a direct stake in its governance, its defense, and its economic success. This decentralization forced communities to become self-reliant, to manage their own resources, and to experiment with new forms of civic organization, from merchant guilds to town councils. A similar reshaping occurred a world away in the heart of North America. The great city of Cahokia, with its monumental earthen pyramids, was the bustling center of the Mississippian culture. At its peak around the year 1100, it was larger than London at the time, but by the 14th century it was largely abandoned. The reasons are complex, likely involving environmental strain and social upheaval. Yet the people of Cahokia did not vanish. They dispersed, forming a constellation of smaller villages and communities across the riverways. This dispersal was not a step backward into simplicity. It was a strategic adaptation. Living in smaller, more spread-out settlements was more sustainable, putting less pressure on local resources like game and timber. These villages maintained trade networks and cultural connections, and it was from this reshaped landscape of smaller, interdependent communities that the complex societies encountered by later European explorers eventually emerged. The collapse of the mega-city, therefore, forced a vital experiment in human living. It proved that urban life could thrive without a single, overwhelming center. This great shift from a single, colossal engine to a network of smaller, adaptable hubs encouraged more community-focused and environmentally attuned living arrangements. The very principles of modern urban planning, with its emphasis on mixed-use neighborhoods, local governance, and sustainable resource management, owe a hidden debt to the painful but necessary fragmentation that followed the fall of forgotten empires. The law of an empire is a command from the throne, a tool for control that serves the state above all. But when the throne itself crumbles, the very idea of law is set free to be reinvented. In the quiet aftermath of Rome's fall, the complex, top-down edicts of the emperors were no longer practical for the small, local communities that now dotted the landscape. People still needed to resolve disputes, protect property, and maintain order, but they had to do it without a distant bureaucracy. This necessity gave rise to something profoundly different: the written codification of Germanic customary law. Tribes like the Visigoths, Franks, and Lombards began to write down their ancient oral traditions. These law codes, with names like the Salic law, were not handed down from a god-king. They were based on long-standing community practices, and they placed a surprising emphasis on the individual. A person's worth was defined by their wergild, a specific monetary value that had to be paid to their family if they were harmed or killed. This concept recognized the inherent value of each person, a stark contrast to Roman law where an individual's status was often secondary to the interests of the state. Justice became less about imperial decree and more about restoring balance to the community through collective consent and agreed-upon compensation. This shift was a quiet revolution, moving the focus of law from the absolute will of a ruler to the negotiated rights of the people. Centuries later, this same dynamic played out on a grander scale in England. The Norman conquest had centralized royal power, but that power was not absolute. Ambitious kings pushed their authority too far, leading to a rebellion by powerful barons who forced King John to a bargaining table at Runnymede in 1215. The document they produced, the Magna Carta, was not a philosophical treatise on human rights. It was a practical, forced agreement born from a power struggle. Its genius, however, was in its core principle. It established that even the king was not above the law. Specific clauses protected free men from illegal imprisonment and guaranteed the right to a fair trial by one's peers. While its initial benefits were limited to the nobility, the principle it enshrined was universal. The Magna Carta created a precedent that the power of the government could be legally constrained, and that individuals possessed certain rights that authority could not arbitrarily violate. This was the seed from which the mighty tree of constitutional law would grow. These post-collapse legal renegotiations, from the Germanic fields to the English meadows, demonstrate a fundamental pattern. When the monolithic power of an empire shatters, the fragments of authority must be gathered and reassembled. This process forces a conversation about the relationship between the governed and those who govern. The absolute ruler is replaced by the collective, and law slowly transforms from an instrument of control into a shield for the individual. The very concepts we hold dear today, the rule of law and the idea of inalienable human rights, were not born in the brilliant courts of mighty empires, but in the messy, practical, and often violent power vacuums that those empires left behind. An empire's silence is often broken by the scratch of a pen or the stroke of a brush. When the grand political narratives crumble, art becomes the new language of the human spirit, a way to process profound loss and whisper dreams of a future. After the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, Greece entered a period we call the Dark Ages. The knowledge of writing was lost, and the world shrank to isolated villages. Yet, from this silence emerged a new artistic voice. The intricate spirals and warlike scenes of Mycenaean art gave way to something more structured and communal: geometric art. On large funerary vases, painters meticulously arranged meanders, zigzags, and key patterns, a visual order imposed upon a chaotic world. This was not a decline in skill, but a shift in purpose. The art was no longer about celebrating a single powerful king, but about exploring abstract order and perhaps commemorating a community's shared identity. These geometric patterns were the necessary precursors, the disciplined foundation upon which the breathtaking naturalism of classical Greek sculpture and pottery would later be built. A parallel story of artistic resilience unfolded centuries later in the remote monasteries of Ireland and Britain. As Roman order receded from Europe, leaving political fragmentation in its wake, these monastic communities became arcs of knowledge and beauty. In cold stone scriptoria, monks labored for years on single volumes, creating illuminated manuscripts like the legendary Book of Kells. Every page is a universe of intricate detail, with Celtic knots so complex they seem to have no beginning or end, and biblical figures woven into a vibrant tapestry of color and pattern. This was far more than simple decoration. In a world without stability, this immense, painstaking effort was an act of defiance. It was a way to preserve sacred texts, to create a portable beauty that could not be plundered, and to manifest a divine, eternal order that earthly kingdoms clearly lack. The art that flourishes in the shadow of collapse serves a deep psychological need. It is a mechanism for processing collective trauma, for holding onto a cultural identity when political structures vanish, and for literally preserving knowledge in a form that is both durable and beautiful. These artistic flowerings are not a retreat from reality, but a profound engagement with it. They are humanity's way of sifting through the rubble, finding the fragments that still gleam, and reassembling them into something new and hopeful. The geometric vase and the illuminated gospel both whisper the same timeless truth, that our creativity is not a luxury for peaceful times, but a fundamental tool for survival, a stubborn light that insists on shining even in the deepest historical night. A city's walls can be rebuilt, but what happens when the very foundations of meaning have turned to dust? This is the moment when philosophy is born, not in quiet libraries, but in the roaring fires of societal collapse. As the Zhou dynasty's authority disintegrated in China, the land fractured into the violent warring states period. It was an age of brutal conflict and profound uncertainty, where the old rituals and hierarchies no longer provided stability. From this chaos emerged three powerful systems of thought, each offering a radically different prescription for a broken world. Confucius looked at the disorder and saw a failure of human relationships. He taught that order could be restored through strict moral codes, filial piety, and righteous leadership, building harmony from the individual family outward to the state. In stark contrast, Laozi and the Taoists proposed a different path. They argued that the struggle to impose order was the problem itself. True peace came from yielding, from aligning with the natural, effortless flow of the Tao, and by embracing simplicity over complex social engineering. And then there were the legalists like Han Fei, who dismissed both virtue and nature as unreliable. They believed only a clear, harsh system of laws and punishments, applied uniformly by a powerful ruler, could terrify society back into stability. These were not abstract debates. They were survival manuals for a civilization, each one a direct response to the trauma of collapse. A similar explosion of thought occurred half a world away, in the wake of Athens' devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The confident, democratic city-state was humiliated, its golden age tarnished. The old gods and traditions seemed to have failed, and this disillusionment created a vacuum that philosophy rushed to fill. Socrates took to the streets not with answers but with relentless questions. He challenged every unexamined assumption about justice, virtue, and the good life, forcing his fellow citizens to think for themselves in a world where handed-down truths had proven hollow. His student, Plato, absorbed this lesson and built upon it a grand vision. He conceived of a perfect, eternal world of forms, a realm of absolute truth and justice that stood in stark contrast to the flawed and fleeting shadow world of politics. His ideal republic was a philosophical blueprint for a state ruled not by popular whim or tyrannical force, but by reason, led by philosopher kings who had glimpsed these higher realities. Then came Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, who brought philosophy back down to earth. He championed empirical observation and logical categorization, systematically studying everything from politics and ethics to biology. He provided the intellectual tools to understand and organize a messy, complicated reality. These Greek thinkers, like their Chinese counterparts, were not merely pondering life's mysteries. They were constructing new ethical frameworks, new ways to define a just society and a meaningful human life in the absence of old certainties. The profound questions forced upon humanity by these collapses have never lost their relevance. What is the proper balance between individual freedom and social responsibility? Is human nature fundamentally good, requiring cultivation like a garden, or is it flawed, needing the rigid walls of law to contain it? Should a leader rule by virtuous example, by absolute power, or by the consent of the governed? These are not ancient curiosities. They are the very questions that underpin our modern conceptions of human rights, constitutional government, and international law. The enduring wisdom that emerged from those periods of intense suffering and confusion continues to shape our world, a lasting testament to the human mind's incredible ability to find light in the deepest historical darkness. The fall of an empire shatters its military machine, and from the pieces, ordinary people forge new tools of war. With the professional Roman legions gone, the monolithic battlefield gave way to something more fragmented and personal. In this new world, security was no longer guaranteed by a distant emperor, but by the local lord in his stone castle and the armored knight who served him. This was the feudal knight, a warrior whose expensive armor and trained warhorse represented a huge personal investment, making him the ultimate embodiment of decentralized military power. His dominance, however, was not absolute. From the muddy fields of England emerged a weapon that could challenge his supremacy, the longbow. This simple stave of yew wood, wielded by commoners, could unleash a storm of arrows capable of piercing plate armor at a staggering distance. The battles of Crete and Agincourt were not just English victories, they were social statements proving that disciplined infantry could break the charge of noble cavalry. This democratization of force changed the very soul of conflict. When warfare is no longer the exclusive domain of a professional, state-funded army, innovation thrives out of sheer necessity. The proliferation of castles across Europe forced attackers to become engineers, developing more powerful siege weapons like the trebuchet and learning the delicate art of mining under fortress walls. The need for smaller, more mobile forces to raid and defend local territories encouraged adaptations in tactics and technology that were more agile and responsive than the grand strategies of fallen empires. This constant, desperate competition between the arrow and the armor, the castle and the catapult, became a relentless engine for military science. The strategic principles born in this crucible of decentralized conflict, from the value of ranged projectile warfare to the importance of fortified strongpoints and combined arms tactics, did not fade away. They were studied, refined, and encoded, forming a hidden bedrock of thought that would influence military doctrines for centuries to come. A hungry stomach is a powerful engine for invention. When the sprawling grain fields of the Roman Empire fell silent and the great shipments from Egypt and North Africa ceased, every community across Europe was thrown back on its own resources. Survival demanded a radical shift from large-scale extraction to local self-sufficiency. This was the birthplace of the manorial system, a world centered on the self-contained estate of a lord. While we remember it for its feudal hierarchies, its quiet agricultural revolution was just as transformative. Out of sheer necessity, farmers perfected the three-field system of crop rotation. Instead of farming half the land and leaving the other half fallow, they now divided their fields into three. One section grew wheat or rye, another nurtured legumes like peas and beans, and the third rested. This simple but brilliant rotation did more than just fight soil exhaustion. The legumes naturally fixed nitrogen back into the earth, acting as a natural fertilizer and dramatically boosting overall yields. This was sustainability born from scarcity, a direct and ingenious response to the collapse of a continent-wide food network. A parallel story of agricultural innovation unfolded high in the South American Andes. The Tiwanaku Empire, with its capital on the shores of Lake Titicaca, had sustained a vast population through a massive, raised field system that created microclimates to protect crops from frost. When that central authority fragmented around 1,000 years ago, the large-scale management of these fields became impossible, but the knowledge did not disappear. The local Aymara communities, now operating on a smaller, more independent scale, took this foundational wisdom and refined it, they engineered breathtakingly intricate stone terracing that cascaded down the mountain slopes. These terraces did more than just create flat land for planting. They prevented soil erosion, captured water from mountain rains, and created a series of micro-environments allowing for a diverse range of crops to be grown at different altitudes. They combined this with sophisticated irrigation canals that channeled precious water with precision. This was not a mere imitation of a fallen empire's system. It was an adaptation, an improvement born from the need for resilience without a central planner. The collapse of these monolithic agricultural systems forced a return to the basics, but it was a return with experience. The result was not a descent into primitive farming. It was the emergence of more diverse, more adaptable, and ultimately more sustainable practices. The three-field system in Europe and the terraced landscapes of the Andes both shared a common legacy. They were decentralized answers to a central failure. This shift from extraction to stewardship, from monoculture to diversity, created a stronger agricultural foundation. The surplus food generated by these more resilient methods would, centuries later, become the fuel for the population growth and economic vitality that powered the rise of the modern world. The end of imperial breadbaskets, it turns out, taught humanity how to better feed itself. Fire is the great enemy of memory. The legendary Library of Alexandria, with its countless scrolls containing the collective wisdom of the ancient world, was consumed by flames. Its destruction stands as an eternal symbol of our deepest fear, that the collapse of a great civilization means the irreversible loss of its knowledge, a dark age descending not just on politics, but on the human mind itself. Yet this story of pure loss is only half the truth. The very act of collapse, the looming shadow of forgetting, creates a powerful and urgent counterforce, a desperate drive to preserve. In the turbulent centuries following Rome's fall, as Europe fragmented into isolated kingdoms, it was the quiet, stone-walled monastic scriptoria that became the fortresses of memory. Here, monks dedicated their lives to the painstaking labor of transcription. With ink and vellum, they copied not only the Bible, but also the surviving works of Roman poets, Greek philosophers, and ancient historians. This was not a leisurely academic pursuit. It was a sacred duty, a race against time and decay, a conscious effort to save the light of the past from being snuffed out by the surrounding darkness. Each meticulously copied manuscript was a seed carefully stored away, waiting for a future spring. A similar, grand-scale project of preservation was unfolding in the East. As the Abbasid Caliphate rose, its rulers established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. This was not merely a library, but a vibrant, state-funded center of translation and scholarship. Its mission was to actively gather the scattered knowledge of the fallen empires that had preceded it, from the philosophy of Greece to the medicine of Persia and the astronomy of India. Teams of scholars translated these works into Arabic, creating a new, synthesized repository of global knowledge. This incredible effort ensured that the intellectual legacy of civilizations that had politically collapsed would not die, but would instead be carried forward, reanimated in a new language and a new cultural context. The dynamic here is profound. While some knowledge is always and inevitably lost in the fires of collapse, that very loss sharpens our appreciation for what remains. The threat of oblivion creates an imperative to save. It forces humanity to develop new methods of preservation, from the monastic copying room to the great translation house, and to find new, more resilient vessels for its most precious ideas. This relentless struggle between loss and preservation is a hidden engine of cultural survival. It reminds us that the value of knowledge is felt most keenly when it is threatened. and that the urgent efforts to save it in one dying age become the greatest gift to the generations yet to be born. The rigid control of an empire over its trade routes is a fragile illusion. When that central authority dissolves, commerce does not simply vanish. It finds a new path, like water flowing around a fallen log. The Roman Empire's slow decline did not erase the Silk Road, but it shattered the organized, state-sponsored caravans that had moved under its protection. The old route became more perilous, its costs driven higher by bandits and unstable new kingdoms. This very danger, however, created an opportunity for a different kind of trade, one that was more decentralized, resilient, and ultimately more far-reaching. New players emerged to fill the void, from Arab merchants in the Indian Ocean to Viking traders navigating the river systems of Eastern Europe. They did not rely on a single emperor's peace, but on their own knowledge of the winds, their networks of local contacts, and their ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. This redirection of trade was not a step backward, but an evolution. It forced commerce to become more agile, weaving a more intricate and robust web of global connection. A similar transformation unfolded half a world away in Southeast Asia. The magnificent Khmer Empire, with its capital at Ankara, was a dominant land power whose influence radiated across the mainland. Its decline, influenced by environmental shifts and external pressures, gradually loosened its grip on overland trade. As the land routes became less secure and less profitable, the economic center of gravity began to shift. Merchants turned their gaze to the sea. The maritime routes threading through the islands of the Malay archipelago from Sumatra to Java suddenly surged in importance. Ports like Srivijaya grew into bustling, cosmopolitan hubs, where Chinese junks, Indian dhows, and Arab vessels met in a vibrant exchange. This was not merely a change of address for trade. It was the birth of a new global crossroads. For the first time, regions that had been relatively isolated were drawn into a vast, interlocking system. Spices from the Moluccas, textiles from India, and porcelain from China now flowed along these sea lanes, but they carried more than just material wealth. These ships were also vessels of ideas, carrying new religious beliefs like Islam and Buddhism deep into the archipelago, and bringing advanced technologies in shipbuilding and navigation to new shores. This accelerated integration was an early form of globalization, a preview of the interconnected planet we know today. The constant, unpredictable reconfiguration of trade following every major collapse has been one of history's most powerful, if unsung, forces. It breaks open monopolies, forces innovation in finance and transport, and tirelessly stitches the world back together in new and surprising patterns. The very map of our global economy is a palimpsest written over the faded trade routes of empires long gone. A rigid social pyramid is the ultimate symbol of imperial control. For centuries, the Roman Empire was defined by its unshakable hierarchy, with an old, landowning aristocracy at the peak and the vast majority of people, from soldiers to farmers, locked into their predetermined stations. Your birth determined your destiny, but when that pyramid crumbled, the dust did not settle neatly back into the same old order. Instead, the rubble became a ladder for those with the courage and the cunning to climb. The collapse of centralized authority created a power vacuum where new kinds of men could seize influence. Barbarian warlords, who would have been seen as uncivilized outsiders by the old Roman elite, now became kings of new territories. Local strongmen, skilled fighters who could protect a village when no legion was coming, amassed followers and land. Merchants, once looked down upon by the noble classes, found that their control over scarce goods and their networks of trade gave them a form of power that rivaled ancient bloodlines. These were the new men rising not from noble birth, but from sheer necessity and ambition in a world turned upside down. This dramatic restructuring was not confined to Europe. On the vast Eurasian steppe, the disintegration of the Mongol Empire created a similar opening. For generations, the descendants of Genghis Khan had ruled with an iron fist, their authority absolute. But as their unified empire splintered, the old rules of legitimacy based solely on royal lineage began to lose their force. From this chaotic landscape emerged a figure who embodied this new social mobility, a man named Zhu Yuanzhang. He began his life in crushing poverty, his family wiped out by famine and plague. He was a beggar, then a novice monk surviving on alms, yet in the turmoil of the collapsing Yuan dynasty, he joined a rebel army. Through a combination of raw talent, strategic genius, and relentless ambition, he rose through the ranks, eventually commanding the very force that would drive the Mongols from China. This former peasant and beggar monk founded the Ming dynasty, one of China's most illustrious ruling houses, and ruled as the Hongwu emperor for 30 years. His astonishing ascent from the very bottom of society to its absolute pinnacle would have been unthinkable under the stable, rigid hierarchies of a mature empire. This leveling effect, for all its inherent violence and chaos, has been a recurring engine of social renewal throughout history. The collapse of an old order shatters the monopoly on power held by a hereditary elite. It forcibly clears the stage, allowing for talent and ambition to erupt from the most unexpected quarters. This painful process, repeated again and again after great falls, has been a hidden force in making societies more dynamic, more resilient, and ultimately, more open to the idea that leadership should be earned, not merely inherited. The term Dark Age itself is a shadow cast by the empires that came before. We have long been taught to see the centuries following a great collapse as a time of ignorance and retreat, a dismal interruption in the march of progress. But modern historians are now lifting this veil of prejudice to reveal a very different reality. These so-called Dark Ages were not an emptiness but a transformation. Consider the European early Middle Ages, the period after Rome's fall. The grand imperial chronicles fell silent, creating the illusion that nothing of importance was happening. Yet, in the absence of a central emperor, local kingdoms were actively writing down their own laws, codifying ancient customs into documents like the Salic law of the Franks. This was not a decline in justice, but a localization of it, moving law closer to the people it served. In Chile monastic scriptoria, artists were not merely copying old texts, they were inventing breathtaking new forms like the intricate illuminated manuscripts of Ireland, their vibrant pages a defiant celebration of beauty in a fragmented world. And in the fields, farmers were quietly perfecting the three-field system of crop rotation, a revolutionary agricultural advance that would eventually feed a continent. The darkness was not a lack of human activity, it was simply a lack of a single, loud voice recording it. The same holds true for the Greek Dark Ages. After the palatial fortresses of the Mycenaeans were abandoned, the population dispersed and literacy was lost. For centuries, this has been painted as a catastrophic void. But we now understand this era as an essential period of simmering cultural synthesis. As different groups moved and mingled across the Greek peninsula, their stories, their gods, and their traditions began to blend in new and powerful ways. The epic poems of Homer, the very bedrock of Western literature, were forged not in the courts of kings, but in the oral traditions of these migrating communities. The Greek Dark Ages were not a time of death, but a necessary gestation, a quiet consolidation of diverse elements that would later explode into the brilliant light of classical Greece. This crucial reframing challenges everything we thought we knew about collapse. It asks us to look past the fallen monuments and listen for the quieter sounds of progress, the local innovations, the legal experiments, and the cultural fusions that flourish when the grand narrative falls apart. What we call a dark age is often just the vital, hidden work of rebuilding the world from the ground up. In the silence left by fallen cities and forgotten kings, humanity begins to tell itself stories. These are not mere tales for entertainment, but vital tools for survival, narratives crafted to make sense of a world that has come undone. When the historical record fades with an empire's collapse, mythology rises to fill the void, offering a new kind of order built not on laws but on legend. Consider the Epic of Troy. Whether a historical city fell or a poetic one was built, its story became a cornerstone for two of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. For the Greeks, Homer's Iliad was more than a war story. It was a profound exploration of honor, rage, and the fragile nature of human life, providing a shared cultural touchstone for a people who are often divided into squabbling city-states. Centuries later, the Roman poet Virgil looked to that same fallen city and saw a different beginning. His Aeneid tells of the Trojan prince Aeneas, who escapes the burning ruins to embark on a divine mission that leads him to the shores of Italy. This was a powerful founding myth for Rome, directly linking its imperial destiny to the glorious ashes of a legendary past. These poems were national projects, shaping how entire cultures understood their own identity, their values, and their place in the world. They transformed a military defeat into a moral victory and a chaotic migration into a destined journey. A similar process unfolded in the misty hills of post-Roman Britain. With the legions gone and the land fractured into warring kingdoms, a profound need for hope and unity emerged. From this fertile ground of uncertainty sprang the legends of King Arthur. Here was a narrative of a once and future king who would rise in his people's darkest hour to restore a lost age of justice and order. The Round Table, where every knight was equal, was a powerful metaphor for a fairer society, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of invasion and feudal strife. These stories were not escapist fantasy. They were a form of cultural therapy, a way for a traumatized people to process their collective loss and imagine a future worth fighting for. The myths born from collapse are far more than fiction. They become the cultural DNA of a people, carrying core values, fears, and aspirations across generations. They provide a framework for understanding catastrophe not as a meaningless end, but as a necessary trial, a crucible that forges a stronger identity. The Arthurian ideal of chivalry would influence European concepts of nobility and romance for 1,000 years. The Roman virtue of pietas, the duty to gods, family, and state so perfectly embodied by Aeneas, became a model for civic responsibility. These narratives are so deeply embedded in our art, our literature, and our political rhetoric that we often fail to see their ancient origins in the rubble of a fallen world. They remind us that our greatest weapon in the face of chaos is not a sword but a story, and that the tales we tell in the darkness are the very ones that guide us toward the dawn. The climate itself has a history written in ice and stone. Recent breakthroughs in paleoclimatology, the science of studying ancient climates, are now revealing a startling pattern. The collapse of many great civilizations aligns precisely with dramatic and abrupt shifts in the global climate. The mighty Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, one of the world's first great multinational states, did not simply fall to an invading army. Its decline around 2,200 years before the Common Era coincides exactly with evidence of a devastating mega-drought, a dry period that lasted for more than a century. Ice cores drilled from ancient glaciers and sediment samples from the Gulf of Oman tell a story of catastrophic windstorms, carrying the topsoil from the parched plains of Akkad far out to sea. The empire's intricate irrigation canals ran dry, its grain stores emptied, and the social contract that promised security in exchange for obedience shattered under the strain. This was not a backdrop to history, it was the main event, an environmental force that actively dismantled a complex society. A similar drama unfolded centuries later and an ocean away, in the lush heartland of the classic Maya. Their civilization was a tapestry of brilliant city-states, masters of their environment who built vast reservoirs to capture rainwater for the dry seasons. Yet their collapse between the 8th and 10th centuries aligns with periods of severe, multi-decade rainfall reduction. When the rains failed for generations, even their ingenuity reached its limit. The reservoirs that sustained their great cities dried up, crop yields plummeted, and the kings, who were believed to be divine intermediaries responsible for bringing the rains, lost their authority. The population faced a stark choice: starve in the magnificent stone cities or disperse into the jungle. These findings fundamentally change how we understand history. Environmental factors are not a passive stage upon which human drama plays out. They are active, often dominant, drivers of historical change. This understanding forces us to appreciate the profound vulnerability of complex societies. A civilization optimized for a specific, stable set of climate conditions can become incredibly brittle when those conditions vanish. The entire structure, from its religious justification to its economic distribution, can fracture under the environmental strain. Yet within this vulnerability lies a lesson in profound ingenuity. The survivors of these climate-driven collapses did not simply vanish, they adapted. They migrated, they developed new crops, they invented new water management techniques, and they forged new social compacts. Today, as we face our own unprecedented climate challenges, these ancient lessons on resilience and adaptation are not merely academic. They are a vital inheritance. They teach us that the true test of a society is not its wealth or power during times of plenty, but its collective ingenuity and flexibility when the world it was built for begins to change. The silent stones of Göbekli Tepe have a story to tell. This ancient site in Turkey, with its massive, intricately carved pillars arranged in circles, predates Stonehenge by a staggering 6,000 years. Its very existence forces us to rewrite the history books, proving that complex, coordinated societies emerged long before we ever imagined, and long before the invention of agriculture. This is the profound power of archaeology. It does not merely dig up artifacts, it resurrects entire worlds from the dust, challenging our most fundamental assumptions about human progress. For centuries, the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia were little more than names in the Bible, their stories locked away in symbols we could no longer read. The Rosetta Stone, with its parallel inscriptions, finally cracked the code of the hieroglyphs, pulling the pharaohs out of mythological shadow and into the light of history. Similarly, the patient decipherment of Mesopotamian cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing on clay tablets, revealed the detailed laws of Hammurabi and the Epic of Gilgamesh, a literary masterpiece thought lost for millennia. Each of these breakthroughs was like switching on a light in a darkened room, illuminating civilizations we had forgotten even existed. But archaeology's greatest gift may be its ability to show us the roads not taken. By uncovering the unique social structures of the Indus Valley, with its emphasis on civic order over royal glorification, or the maritime prowess of the Minoans, we see that our current path toward centralized, hierarchical states was not the only option. Humanity has experimented with countless forms of society, each a unique answer to the challenges of its time. Every trowel of earth turned at a dig site is a potential challenge to our modern arrogance, a reminder that our civilization is not the inevitable pinnacle of human endeavor, but simply one of many possibilities that have flickered across time. The ground beneath our feet is a vast library, and its silent witnesses are only now beginning to speak. A fallen empire's shadow stretches far longer than its monuments. The psychological scar left by a great collapse lingers for centuries, often disguised as a deep and persistent nostalgia. Long after the Roman Republic had been replaced by emperors, the Roman people and their writers spoke of it as a lost golden age, a time of virtue and liberty. This was not necessarily an accurate memory, but a powerful emotional one, a collective dream of a better, more orderly past that stood in stark contrast to the tumultuous present. Societies grappling with the trauma of disintegration frequently reshape their history into a mythic ideal, a psychological anchor in a world that has lost its bearings. This longing for a lost golden age is a universal human response to profound change. In China, a different but equally powerful pattern emerged from the cycle of dynastic rise and fall. Historians and philosophers developed a cyclical view of history where each new dynasty gained the mandate of heaven, ruled virtuously, entered a period of decline, and ultimately lost that mandate to a new power. This framework was not just a description of events, it was a moral and psychological coping mechanism. It made the terrifying chaos of collapse part of a predictable, almost natural order. It allowed a society to process its trauma by believing that after the darkness, a new dawn was not just possible, but inevitable. This collective memory, whether a nostalgic dream or a cyclical story, becomes the very lens through which new societies define themselves. A rising culture might define itself in direct opposition to the perceived decadence and corruption of the empire that fell before it, vowing to avoid its mistakes. Or it might strive to reclaim that lost glory, to rebuild the imagined perfection of the past. You can see this dynamic echoing through our own world. The ghost of Rome influenced the ambitions of Charlemagne and the architects of the American Republic. The dream of a unified Chinese empire persisted through centuries of fragmentation. This psychological dimension explains why certain themes are so hauntingly recurrent in our literature and politics: the fear of decline, the myth of a heroic founding, the desperate search for a unifying national story. The way we remember a fallen empire is never a simple recording of facts. It is always profoundly a reflection of our own present needs and future hopes. These recurring patterns of collapse reveal a hidden curriculum for humanity. The fall of each forgotten empire was a brutal but necessary lesson in resilience, forcing a great scattering of people, ideas, and power. This breakdown of rigid, centralized orders created the conditions for a grand recombination, a mixing of genetic lineages, technological secrets, and cultural philosophies on a scale that would have been impossible under the shadow of a single, dominant state. The intricate feudal contracts of medieval Europe, born from the ashes of Rome, planted the early seeds of reciprocal obligation that would one day evolve into modern legal systems and concepts of individual rights. The precious knowledge of the ancient world, preserved and dispersed by monks and scholars during times of fragmentation, did not vanish. It lay dormant, waiting to fuel the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. The frantic search for new trade routes, spurred by the collapse of old monopolies like the Byzantine grip on spices, did not isolate the world. It accidentally stitched it together, launching the first waves of true globalization. This is the profound synthesis. Our modern world, with its relentless innovation, its emphasis on personal liberty, and its deeply interconnected global networks, is not a sudden invention that appeared from nowhere. It is a slow accretion. It is the cumulative result of countless lessons hard learned in the ruins of the past. Each collapse, for all its undeniable tragedy, cleared away the overgrowth of outdated systems, making room for new, more adaptable forms of human organization to take root. The very chaos we fear is, in the long view of history, a catalyst. It is the brutal but effective teacher that has, time and again, forced us to rebuild our world not as it was but as it could be. Our modern world hums with a familiar fragility. We face our own potential drivers of collapse, not from invading sea peoples, but from a shifting climate, the depletion of vital resources, and deep geopolitical fractures. The historical record offers a sobering diagnosis, but also a powerful prescription. The forgotten empires teach us that resilience is not found in monolithic strength, but in diversity and adaptability. A global food system reliant on a handful of staple crops is as vulnerable as the Roman grain shipments from a single province. A centralized energy grid mirrors the Hittite monopoly on iron, a single point of failure for an entire civilization. The lesson is clear: our survival may depend on building redundancy and strength from the ground up. This means bolstering local food systems that can weather global shocks. It means investing in decentralized renewable energy, where communities can generate their own power rather than depending on a distant, fragile network. It calls for stronger community governance, where neighbors know each other and can cooperate to solve local problems, much like the towns that grew around medieval castles. The story of these ancient cycles is not a prophecy of doom. It is a guide for recalibration. The goal is not to prevent all change, an impossible task, but to manage it with the wisdom of the past. We can learn to bend without breaking, to decentralize without disintegrating, and to see moments of crisis not as a final ending, but as a painful yet necessary transition. By embracing this historical wisdom, we can navigate our current challenges not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of those who understand that after every great fall, humanity has always found a way to build anew. The end of an empire is never truly an end. It is an explosive new beginning disguised as a catastrophe. From the silent ruins of the Indus Valley and the shattered palaces of Minoan Crete, the very foundations of our modern world were laid. These great collapses did not halt human progress, they accelerated it. They forced innovation by shattering old monopolies on knowledge. They encouraged a breathtaking diversity of cultures, languages, and political experiments by breaking apart rigid, centralized control. They reshaped human societies from the ground up, fostering resilience where there was once only brittle order. This is the grand, cyclical rhythm of history, a pattern of creative destruction that has, time and again, cleared the way for a more complex and dynamic future. Our present civilization, with all its global connections and relentless innovation, is not a sudden miracle. It is the direct inheritor of the hard-won lessons learned in the ashes of forgotten empires. Every time a society failed, its people carried its most valuable secrets into the world, scattering the seeds of its knowledge. This long chain of failure and renewal is our collective story. It is a narrative that should empower us as we face our own uncertain future. When we look at our own global challenges, from climate shifts to political fractures, we can choose to see them not with a sense of impending doom, but with the profound understanding that humanity has always possessed a remarkable ability to rebuild. We have always found a way to take the broken pieces of the old world and assemble them into something new, something stronger, and something utterly unexpected. The ghosts of these ancient empires remind us that collapse is not a full stop, but a semicolon in the long story of human ingenuity. We would love to hear which of these forgotten civilizations captures your imagination the most. Was it the mysterious Sea Kings of Crete, the orderly cities of the Indus Valley, or the Iron Masters of the Hittites? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to continue these journeys into the deepest mysteries of our